I would like to thank Ruth for all of the help she's been to me during this whole process. We've been planning this exhibition for about a year and a half now, and she was nice enough to come to New York several times to speak with me and visit my studio and hang out with me and my husband and my friends, and it's been a really great pleasure to work with her, and I appreciate everything you've done during this whole process, as well as Ron, who I just met. I appreciate you introducing my work to Ruth and bringing me here, and Camilo Alvarez, my representative in Boston, who's here. I feel really fortunate to have him here today, and for his support throughout the last few years has been instrumental in bringing my work to the world and giving me a platform to show my work. And I find him to be a very brave and important person in the art world to bring so many amazing artists into the viewer's perspective. And my husband, who's here, who just got here, and without him, I definitely wouldn't be here. So I appreciate him deeply. Okay. So I don't normally go back into talking about my history so far, into like my childhood or anything like that, but I thought it would be kind of interesting to delve into these areas for you because they actually are becoming more and more influential to me as I get older. So the first time I decided that I wanted to become an artist was when I was 6 years old. We had an animation artist come visit our school when I was in the first grade, and he sat down with a piece of paper and a pencil and drew bunny rabbits and made this amazing animation with lines and brought this whole world to life on paper in front of me. And I remember thinking that he was some kind of magician. Like, I couldn't understand how he was able to bring these lines to life with such simplicity and clarity and have all this movement happening in front of me. And from that moment on, I really realized that I wanted to figure out a way to make that happen in my own work. And from that point on, I was pretty captivated with trying to figure out how I could draw anything I could get my hands on. So I'm starting to realize I think I got a lot of my psychedelic colors from Trapper Keeper folders. And I've been kind of laughing, picking out the right ones, but I felt like these were the most appropriate because they were probably exactly like the ones I had. But I distinctly remember going through and trying to figure out, for instance, like how the paw on that tiger became form. Like I remember, I didn't know the words concave and convex, but I remember thinking like, okay, this line curves this way and it curves out that way, and this is how form is created, or this is how this happens. So from a very early age, I was so distinctly engaged with trying to figure out how abstraction formed representation. So, and the colors, I feel like were really instrumental in what I'm doing now. I think it's just sort of an inventory of colors that are constantly streaming through me that I feel like I really absorbed as a child from these sort of really technicolor objects that I had around me. And this is just a small piece of a detail of one of the paintings I'm doing now, or that I have in the gallery now, that sort of shows this engagement with abstraction turning into representation. As I grew older, a lot of, like when I was in high school and junior high, I didn't have a lot of influence of art history or contemporary art magazines of any kind. Most of my references that I was drawing from were from Native American magazines or Native American art images. All of the museums in Oklahoma and the galleries are all influenced by Southwestern art. And so most of the things that I was drawing were all either minority people or Navajo blankets. So I've just since realized something very obvious. This should have been apparent to me all along, but these two things were always in the images that I would draw. And these two, the figure and the pattern, have always been a part of my process, and we'll see that today. You can also see the Technicolor aspect of the blankets. Another part of introducing myself, I suppose, to you would be to talk about how I have two different sides to my personality. One is highly rigorous and organized and meticulous about everything I do, and the other part of myself is very organic and free and is trying to find some sort of organization in something very organic and free-flowing. So these two dichotomies are always struggling inside of me, and I'm always trying to find a way to articulate each side of my personality. They're very distinctly different, and I go in extremes in both ways. And you'll also see that tonight. I brought up another image of something that I probably would have drawn with Prismacolor pencils in high school, and spent hours trying to render something along these lines. And I feel like it's pretty interesting because I noticed when finding these images that a lot of these Native American pictures are very interested in surface quality. So the beads on the shoulders and the cloth on all the fabrics that are painted, or the leather drums, or the feathers and the hair and the skin, and all of that are along the same lines as something that Vermeer would portray. And Vermeer has always been an important person to me because of the tactile, textural qualities that he renders in his paintings. So I'm sure that a lot of you guys have studied Vermeer and learned about how he was able to capture, the really glossy heaviness of wood, or the silkiness of the fabric, or the softness of skin. And he's able to capture the sort of lusciousness in his figures and the areas surrounding his figures that I feel like are sort of similar in relation to the imagery that I was looking at as I was growing up. The other thing that I found when putting together this lecture was there was a lot of sort of opposition in the things that I was seeing as a kid, like in all of the museums and in the government buildings and stuff where I was growing up. There was always this weird relationship between the Native Americans and the white people, and they were always sort of placed together in relationship to each other, and there was no real hierarchy between the two. They were always put in an equal stance, and they were always portrayed in this way of having very easy, good relations with each other. And I think that that sort of contributes to me wanting to find a deeper reasoning for things, or something hidden behind the surface of what we typically see in our culture. And then I left Oklahoma. And I went on a long voyage. And most of my time between 18 and 25 was very haphazard. I spent a lot of time traveling. I went to 9 different countries, and I traveled around the world, and I traveled around the country in Greyhound buses, and most of that time was spent drawing a lot just in a notebook, or I was doing a lot of writing. I still work a lot with my writing, and it's become a part of my drawing process now. But I just wanted to kind of touch base a little bit with that time in my life, because it was very haphazard, but incredibly productive for me, in the sense that I took in a lot of information during that time and didn't conform to any sort of structure that would be considered normal, I guess. I didn't take a straight path towards my undergraduate. It was very loose-ended, but I was very focused the entire time, trying to gather information from what I was experiencing. These are a couple of paintings I found from my undergraduate work where I thought they were kind of interesting. In terms of color, you can see the influence of what I've just been talking about and the patterns that you see at the bottom of her dress. And as far back as I can remember, I've always painted minority figures or people of different ethnicities and found them the most engaging to work with because of the color and because of their sort of misplacement in our art history, and I wanted to give them a really strong ground to be in. This painting was influenced actually by a painting I saw in a thrift store when I was like 23, and it was a painting of a ship, and it was $5, and I still wish I had bought it because it was such an important piece to me. But it was a ship, and it had 3 African Americans rowing the ship, and inside the water, it was a very impasto, thickly painted water, and inside the water it said, "We run things." And so this painting was derived from that thrift store painting. And I was thinking of her on top of the ship, and it's inscribed at the bottom, "We run things." And I wanted to have a very monolithic presence for her so that you, the viewer, would be sort of looking at her. And these are a couple of drawings from my undergraduate. You can see that I'm very engaged with line and form, and I also think that there's a sort of mysticism in especially my earlier drawings that are resonant in my work today, where it's sort of this foggy, almost some people would say spiritual essence that they have to them that, again, I think were from these Native American images. Another drawing of a figure. And you can also see the abstraction and representation happening where you're not exactly sure where you're able to focus. So then I ended up going to graduate school, and the first part of my graduate program, I was really interested in Rembrandt self-portraits and also Cindy Sherman portraits, who I'm sure a lot of you guys know. But I'm mostly going to focus on the Rembrandt self-portraits today. What intrigued me about Rembrandt was I wasn't really into Rembrandt paintings at all when I was studying in school. But when I found his self-portraits, I became completely captivated by him, and I think he's one of the only painters I can actually look at and really feel extremely moved. But I'm sure a lot of you know, if you've taken art history, his series of self-portraits that he did pretty much his entire life. And there's a couple of things that particularly interest me about these paintings, and that he was painting them during a time where people didn't see themselves as individuals necessarily. They were only supposed to be a part of a church congregation or making work about the church or things such of that nature. And he was really individualizing himself in these portraits. And you can see through this series how he sort of changes his demeanor in each one. So, like in this one, he's sort of scraggly, almost like a college kid or something like that. And here he's rather stately. And here he's almost like impersonating all of these different identities, almost like he's acting for us in front of the viewer. Here's another one where he's a little bit stately. Almost humorous, tender paintings. And the other thing that I thought that was quite interesting about these works were that from the beginning of his study of the self-portraits until the end of his life, his painting surface actually changed. So early on, he was painting very thin. The canvas the canvases were quite, like, they weren't layered very much, they were very smooth, and as he grew older, and as I think the layers of his life built, the more texture he would put onto the canvas. So by the end of his life, his paintings are actually quite thick. And I thought that that was a really interesting metaphor to see how he layered on the paint as his life layered onto him, almost like tree rings. So these were the first portraits I made while I was in graduate school. And they were really dark and visceral and gooey and immediate for me. And I felt very connected to them. And a lot of my professors thought that they looked like zombies. And so I was horrified. And I kind of hid them away. And I was like, I'll never do them again. I was so embarrassed because I was afraid of them looking like zombies. Because that, especially at that time in like 2002, there was no cultural relationship to zombies, and it was an embarrassing comment, not something to be proud of. And so I wasn't ready for them to come out, and I don't think that anybody around me was really ready for them as well. But I'd always had like a strong love for them and connection for them, and the way that they came out was very immediate and natural. So after I abandoned this sort of zombie paintings, I started looking at a lot of Sue Williams, especially early Sue Williams' work. And I liked the way that she engaged text, and I liked the simplicity of her color, or the saturation of her colors, and the line qualities especially. It was sort of like she was speaking to me on all the different levels that I was looking for. She had this ability to capture line. She had really said what she wanted to say in a very blatant and sort of obtuse way that I thought that her paintings, especially the early ones, were quite brave, and they were a really big inspiration to me and helped me reevaluate my own work and the possibilities of it. Here's another line drawing of hers. And it also brought out some humor in me. I did a couple of more portraits that I felt like were funny, and I'd always wanted to bring my humor into my work, but I didn't know how, because it always came across as a little bit awkward, and it still does. I don't know that very many people get my sense of humor most of the time, but I'm always trying to be funny. This was one of the early paintings I did that I felt like brought out my sense of humor. Almost done with my graduate work. I had, on the side of doing my paintings, I felt very proud of these drawings I had made that were on cash register tape. And I had really limited my tools and my process, because I had really turned into an alchemist in my studio as far as my paintings were concerned. I was trying to mix oils with acrylic. I was trying to mix inks and sculptural materials, and it was just always turning into this big blob. And I couldn't get any kind of articulation out of my painting material. It just ended up being always abstract, and I've never quite been able to go fully over to abstraction. And so I brought all of my process back to the drawing and just used a couple of pens and this extended source to work with. So it was just sort of a never-ending drawing for me, and I kept working on it and recording things that were around me, and to the extent that they ended up being like 387 feet long.
Oh my goodness.
So this was what I felt like I was leaving graduate school with, in the sense that I felt like my voice was in these works, and I felt very proud of them, and they were very committed pieces that I felt incredibly strongly about. And I had an exhibition and at the school that I went to, and to make a very long story short, we would be here all night if I really went into it, but the works were misunderstood as being art and thrown away in the trash.
Oh.
And so that led to trauma. As you can see, I turned into an animal in my studio. And after that, I really went back into my painting practice and tried to reevaluate everything I had done up until that point. Not because I felt that the drawings were invalid, but just because I needed to really outlet all of the feelings that I had at that time and process all the things that had happened during that moment, and almost resurrect a lot of those images that I felt like I'd almost drowned because they were thrown away in a trash can that was filled with liquid. So it was like seeing all of those very finite edges sort of melt away in the water. I really wanted to resurrect them somehow, and so the next body of work that I made was really dedicated to bringing back those characters that I had loved so much. And a lot of the people that I was looking at the time were de Kooning, who was very out of style at the time. Nobody would even look at de Kooning when I was looking at him, and I just thought he was a total genius, and nobody would really give him any credibility. And then Carol Dunham was another influence because of his way of capturing liquid or capturing an explosion. And at the time, I really felt like what had happened was some sort of war or explosion with my process. And I also was looking at George Condo, who is very much a humorist and not afraid to be silly. And a lot of those drawings that I'd made were really capturing my humor in a way that I was bringing out these characters that were incredibly invented in the same way that George Condo had. So I wanted to bring them in. This was the exhibition I had shortly after the drawings were destroyed. It was called No Dumping. It was sort of my own personal vendetta against the entire situation. This was one of the large-scale paintings that I made that I felt was a compilation of all those images that had drowned. It's almost like this painting is like a giant ship or a shipwreck of some kind, and there's no real articulation. Everything's bleeding over onto itself, and it was just a gorgeous mess for me to make. And I think that at that time, I needed to make a gigantic mess in my painting and not necessarily worry about what was articulated and what wasn't. But you can also see in here, I really start manipulating the paint in interesting ways. Like I was using a lot of ink and acrylic together and then layering oil on top of that. It's really hard to read my work in photographs because there is a lot of texture. And obviously once you see it tonight, you'll understand that there's a lot of layering and a lot of tactile surface happening that you might not otherwise catch in images. These were a series of drawings that I made that were from memory of these characters, and I had created a process where I would draw the character and wash it away. My husband helped me name those. So this sort of leads us closer to today. Shortly after I had that event happen, I was looking for a new way to engage the processes that I spoke of earlier in terms of uniting my pattern making that I always wanted to do with some sort of abstract or representational figurative work. And I had visited the Giesbin exhibition. I don't know if you guys are familiar with these works, but they're quilt works made by rural women in Mississippi who had no education in art, and they made these incredible quilts out of things that they found around their house. They would use their husband's denim jeans. So when you see the works in person, they're incredibly large scale, and you can see stains like coffee stains on some of the jeans that they would use, or even ketchup or cigarette burns and things like that that you can't really see in the pictures here. But going to this show at the High Museum was one of the most influential experiences I'd ever had. I had a really hard time leaving that exhibition. I was incredibly moved and captivated by each one of these works, because to me they were like large-scale abstract paintings or modern paintings. Here's another one. You can kind of see in here the denim jeans and the bleach stains. And they would just use batting from the floor in the factories that their families worked in. They're incredibly dynamic. And on the other side of the wall from this Giesbin exhibition was the permanent collection of the High Museum. And when I walked over to see the permanent collection, I found it really interesting that Peter Halley and people like Jonathan Lasker and Richter and academics of that nature were existing on just the other side of the wall from the Giesbin. And I felt this interesting correlation happening when I viewed the two in the same building, but just on opposite sides of the wall. Because they're both happening at the same time. Essentially, they were made during the same time. It's just that one was from one world and one was from another. And I felt that they were both sort of speaking the same language. So you can see here, this is a Jonathan Lasker and a Giesbin quilt. And somehow I feel like they're both arriving at similar levels of sophistication. So I went back to my studio after that visit, and I sat down on my floor for almost 3 years with a spool of yarn and a bucket of paint. And I decided that I was determined to transmute paint into yarn, and I didn't know how to do it. And I was like a mad scientist in my studio for a very long time, trying to figure that out. And I had tried everything I could possibly think of and finally arrived at the right combination. And at that time I was collecting a lot of lace patterns and slave blankets and all kinds of different textile references, and I was drawing those images because I don't really have any experience sewing, but I wanted to bring out the line that I found in the sewing pieces of the Giesbin, and also bring out the line qualities from my drawings, but I wanted to bring the line qualities from my drawings into some form of dimensionality. So it's almost like I was resurrecting my lines from my drawings, but bringing them into dimension instead of just being paintbrush lines. So then I found a way to sort of look for answers in Seurat and de Kooning. And these two people also have this sort of correlation that I was speaking of before, where I feel like Seurat is on the other side of that meticulousness, where he's really engaged with his methodology in the sense of finite mark making, whereas de Kooning is just as finite, he's just on the other side of abstraction. So I felt like I was in a world between these two artists. And these were some of the first works that I made during that time that I was very secretive at that time, and I'm really embarrassed about what I was doing, because it was a really vulnerable time for me in my studio for at least 3 or 4 years. And you can't tell, this is a large-scale painting, but all of those red lines, or all of those red spots are those sewn lines. And here, these are some of my early attempts at bringing this abstraction with these line qualities. And they're, unfortunately, I'm sorry for the image quality. I had no idea what I was doing back then. And this was my studio back then, in Savannah. I've always worked with archetypes of classical drawings. I want there to be some sort of influence of classical imagery found in like historical works like Durer or Rembrandt or something of that nature. Like, because I'm working, I think, in such an unusual or unpredictable manner in terms of my painting methodologies, I want there to be a base in the classics. After I had gone through that process of trying to merge the line with the abstraction, I sort of felt like I really needed to master the lines in a way that was more meticulous. So at that time, I really started learning these crochet patterns as much as I could. It was almost like I was using a pen instead of, I use pastry bags or piping bags to draw the lace patterns. And at that time, I was really trying to learn exactly how I could do that in a way that would be incredibly believable. So I started making these blanket paintings, and for at least 2 years I was making large-scale blanket paintings. And there was a couple of things I liked about them. The first was that it gave me something to do that I felt like I could really achieve and not have to worry about the outcomes. Because in a lot of my abstract works, I left so much up to surprise, and I wasn't sure how things were going to work out because I wasn't very comfortable with using the material and in this alchemist kind of way that I've been speaking of. And so when I was making the blanket paintings, I felt really comfortable with executing something I knew would come out right. So I did this for a couple of years where I just made these blanket paintings. And they were a really good exercise for me. This is like 8 foot by 6 foot. They were really good exercise for me because they were interesting in terms of perception. Like when you would, and you can see a couple of works tonight that I've done the blanketed technique with. When you walk around the blanket or when you walk around the canvas, it gives you an experience. It helps you see things from different perspectives. So it's an optical illusion almost when you move around the canvas. And I've always wanted the viewer to have that sort of experience when they're viewing my work, that they get a chance to move around the canvas, they get a chance to engage with it in a very physical way. So I use the material incredibly physically, but I also want you, the viewer, to have a physical experience where you're moving around things. So I had done these blanket paintings for 2 or 3 years, and I came to a point with them where I felt like I had mastered this technique. Like it was almost becoming too finite or too much like something that was a little easy for me. And I felt a little fraudulent after mastering it because I knew I could do it and I knew I could do it well. It was just not the whole picture. It wasn't that other end of things. It wasn't that figurative part. It wasn't the abstraction. I still needed this other visceral quality of my work to merge with this meticulous part of my personality. So I did a lot of soul searching during this time. I had arrived in New York and I was doing my residency at Triangle, and Triangle gave me a platform because they awarded me a year in a studio for free. And so I felt like it was valid for me to really re-explore and experiment and give myself a new assignment to investigate my materials yet again. Even though I felt like I had triumphed over something, I decided that it was time for me to open the door back up and try again and find something new, perhaps. So in this soul searching, I started thinking about things again that were influential of me as a child. And I had listened to this lecture from this artist who was talking about how he was diagnosed with cancer, and the most effective work that he started finding after he had gotten his diagnosis was going back and trying to make the things that he wanted to make as a child. And so I started making this inventory list of all the things that I wanted to make as a child, and one of them were the Michael Jackson Thriller zombies. And it was interesting to me because there was that correlation with the first zombies that I had made in graduate school. So I decided to bring them back, and I brought them back to life, so to speak. And it was with a new engagement. It was with a new understanding of my materials. And I felt a lot more free, and that I could manipulate the materials with more experience. And one thing that I found pretty interesting that I still hold as truth about my work is that I want you to feel like you want to eat it, but at the same time you want to vomit. So I want there to be this internal physical response in viewing my work that you're not exactly quite sure how you feel, but you know that you are being pulled in many different directions. So I definitely want that guttural sensation, and zombies were actually a really good subject to use for that, obviously. A lot of people found these very repulsive, and a lot of people found them funny. So I felt like I was doing something doing something right, because people saw them as humorous as well as disgusting. And I felt like that was really the angle that I had been working to get at all along. The other sort of challenge I took on with these was I decided that no matter what, I was going to find a solution with these paintings. This series of paintings, I believe there were like 15 or 20 of them, and they had sat in a stack in the back of my studio for about 5 months, and I was definitely going to throw them away because I had no idea if they were going to turn out or not. And so I would always look at them as failures. And one day I decided that I was going to stop failing in my painting, and that I was going to find a solution for every problem that I had. And so if you were to have seen this before I ended up finding the zombie in the painting that was before, you would have seen it as a disaster. So for me to find this sort of reformation out of that disaster was incredibly important for my understanding of my own process, and gave me a lot of confidence to feel like I could move forward with any painting that I made and know that there would be an answer, and that there was never a lack of a solution. These were actually shown by Camilo at Volta in 2011. And this was also the first large-scale painting I had made that I felt like combined all of the different methodologies that I've been speaking of, in terms of, if you can see it up close, there's a lot of sewing happening. There's a lot of strips of paint that really, one part of it would look like bacon, another part of it would look like candy, another part would look like a beautiful passage from a Richter. So all of these things were happening at the same time, and I felt like this painting really brought together, for me at least, all of these sort of fleshy mannerisms that I was trying to bring in my work. This is a detail. It just made sense after making the zombie paintings to start bringing them off the canvas, and a lot of the excess paint that I was using in those works were just coming off and onto my palettes, and I felt like I was wasting the paint by not using them. And so I decided to make a head and make a zombie head out of the leftover paint that I had, and it ended up working out really well. And I'd never really done a lot of sculpture, but this was one of the first sculptures that I made that I felt like was almost like a live painting. And when I first started getting interested in bringing the paintings literally out of the surface. So you can see a lot of parts of this painting, like here. I don't know if you can tell, but it actually looks like a fabric pom-pom or something of that nature, and that's actually paint. So there's a lot of different manipulations happening where I disguise like real fabric in small parts, but then in other parts it's the paint. So there's this weird relationship happening, at least materially, where you're sort of confused upon looking at it because you're not sure what's real or not, which has always been an interesting aspect of painting. This had a giant googly eye on it. This was another sculpture that I made. It's called Payless and Prada Pretzel, and it's about a Payless shoe and a Prada shoe coming together as a pretzel. And it has the same sort of theme almost as like a zombie would, or it has some voodoo quality to it. But this was also one of the first times I had brought that sewing technique into another dimension. And also engaged other materials. So shortly after Volta, I was starting to work on my show in Boston titled Hilo. And Hilo was about this dimensionality in painting. I was using a lot of flat surface painting with very thick painting, so I was talking about the high and low resolutions of surface quality and also high and low class structure. And so for my subjects, I was looking at a lot of historical paintings of aristocrats and peasants. And you'll see some of those portraits tonight as well. I wasn't really looking at anyone specific for these images. I was, in general, looking at just historical paintings of aristocrats and peasants. I found their facial expressions really hilarious. So this is an image from the Hilo show. The wall that you see in the back there, right here, I had decided to almost give each one of the methodologies I've been talking about a role in my studio. So it was almost like I designated, I was an employer and my methodologies were my employees. And so I found a certain place for each one of my methodologies and gave them a distinct place to be in my work. And so this wall was the first large-scale blanket piece I had made that wasn't serving necessarily as an actual painting. It was used as a backdrop for my portraits. And the concept behind the wall piece was I had taken swatches from different foundation colors, the tones that I used in that work, and I had taken a lace a piece of lace fabric from a dollar store and used that for my pattern. So what I wanted to do was create a pattern that engaged all of those different flesh tones and moved them and merged them all together. So I wanted to create an equilibrium for the backdrop of these portraits that would entail all of the different flesh colors. And this piece is in the show tonight. So this was an example of one of the peasants that I painted. It's sort of got a tribal influence. And there's a lot of really flat areas with this dimensional surface I've been speaking of. And here it's definitely a very high and low situation where you have paint straight out of the tube with a white bare canvas. On the other side of this wall was a rendition I made of the Luncheon in the Grass, but I wanted it to be like these people were gangsters, and that they had just robbed a bank. And so you can see a lot of money bags, and I had put them in the gallery on a huge pile of dirt. So I renamed it Luncheon on the Hill, and it's obviously a derivative of that famous painting. But here I really got to know how to work with paint in 3 dimensions. And all of these objects that you see for the most part are just paint. And I'm using like this doily here, it's all paint. All of these objects are made of plaster and paint. And the blanket, of course, is part of that sewing technique. This piece is called Hypnotized, and it's also in the show here at Cress. And I worked on this painting for about probably a year and a half. And it was another one of those challenges that I took on where I wasn't going to let it fail. I was going to find an answer for it. And I really was thinking a lot about how we're hypnotized by mass media, and this painting actually has a hypnotic quality to it if you stand in front of it for a long time. It's almost like a Jackson Pollock painting where you get lost in the wilderness of this work. And I really wanted to talk about the chaos and the confusion, and in each part of this you can break it down into pure abstraction. This leads us into the next body of work that I made this last fall. And at the time I was looking at a lot of Bruegel paintings and really delving into the idea of medieval living. And I was studying a lot of medieval times objects and literature, and I found the whole experience interesting because at some point I started, every time I would walk down a street in Brooklyn and see a burrito cart or hear the chiming of the church clock, I started feeling like I was inside a Bruegel painting. And I was thinking a lot about how times may not have changed so much. It's a big fish eating small fish. I also found it interesting to see these sort of native images that I was growing up with that are not so different from these Bruegel paintings. And I found them both to have this sort of life of their own that I was always looking into. I also found these really fascinating James Gilroy images from the UK, and they were really inspirational to me because they really captivated these this differentiation in class systems, the color, the line techniques that were used, and the gruesomeness and the hilarity of the subjects I found to be really interesting. And so in this world that I was finding with these peasanthood worlds, I decided that I wanted to create a love story. And I didn't know how to do that because I always looked at paintings like this of love stories. And so I wanted to capture a love story that wasn't gruesome but also wasn't trite. And I thought of a collected story that I had of a friend of mine I had known in Georgia whose husband worked 2 jobs. And every night when he would come home, she would draw a bath for him and wrap his feet in hot towels at 4 in the morning. And I always found that to be such a beautiful love story. And so I decided to do a series of bathers. Let's see here. Where I'm utilizing that sort of blank space or that empty space. And it's hard to tell here, but there's a lot of surface built up as well. So I did a lot of paintings of male bathers because I don't think that there's very many paintings of male bathers. And I wanted to bring this character out into reality. Here's a kiss. paintings in the show as well. So smushy. This painting was one of the first paintings I ever felt like I captured something that felt like what it really is. So I feel like the way that the paint is used and the subject that's being painted is sort of along the same lines as what is being depicted. These are all from this world. Here I'm starting to actually take some of the sculptures I'm making in the studio and applying them to the canvas. This is Breakfast of Champions. I had done a series of vignettes for this show where you have small sculptures that are almost like my drawings in a way, where the cereal looks like, have you ever seen the cereal Kaboom? No. Well, it's sort of like a sugary cereal, and I wanted to make these little vignettes that were from this daily life of this family I was portraying in the show. This was the first time that I had made an installation that really sort of brought the painting into reality. So the entire painting has completely moved off, where the wall becomes the background and the floor piece becomes the foreground. And this leads us to the final piece that I made for the show. It's called Star Chamber. And during my interest in looking at medieval literature, I found these places called star chambers where in those times they would have these secret meeting rooms where they would paint stars on the ceiling, and they would have really high government officials come in and make the laws for the community. And as they were making the laws, they had painted stars on the ceiling, and they would contemplate their own place in the universe. And I thought that that was a really interesting idea to sort of bring out that the stars onto a painted surface for a viewer to contemplate their own place in the universe. And as I was looking actually into more of this, I started looking into the Native American use of star quilts, and they believed them to be God's eye, and that they would have these ceremonies where they would wrap a star quilt around someone in the community, and it was supposed to be a reminder that a gift is actually, that the honor is in giving, not in receiving. And so I kind of felt that that was an interesting, I think probably subconscious thing that happened with this work as well. So here's the piece. This is all paint, and I had made these little loops of paint so that when you stood in front of the piece, you would sort of be entranced by this infinite space, or these infinite loopholes, almost like you are standing in front of something incredibly infinite. And when you stand to the side of it as well, you have this perceptual orientation that is incredibly optical, just like you would in one of the earlier blanket paintings. And I added another component to this work because I'm at this point currently bringing a lot of my installations into fruition and creating these sculpture components that are alongside the blanketed wall pieces. And so I was looking at, here's an image. I was looking at Judy Chicago's dinner party, and I wanted to create a dinner party of actual stars for this work to have a sort of combination of some sort of worship, like us as a culture worshiping the influences of movie stars, and also now that these pieces are in place, it's almost as though these movie stars are positioned under the infinite star sky. So Chicago piece. So here we have one for Madonna. A lot of these are from pop culture, and I'm talking about how we as a people sort of look to these pop cultural references as our guide. And what I'm asking you to do in this piece is to look at yourself as your own guide. These spoons were highly influential for this piece. Each table setting has its own spoon with the label of the star. This one was for Chris Rock. So I'm ending with a bunny. I just saw this lecture at the Met by someone who still believes in magic. It's a scientist who still believes in magic. And I feel like art is an incredibly magical process. And throughout all of my different processes and techniques, I've always found some sort of alchemical or magical relationship to my materials. And I believe if you stay in your studio for a really long time, you'll find your own